The shelter smelled of bleach and fear. Rows of metal bars rattled whenever a restless paw struck against them, but in the farthest corner, where the fluorescent lights barely reached, a German shepherd lay pressed against the cold concrete wall. His ribs showed through his coat, his eyes dulled with weeks of silence. Every time footsteps echoed down the corridor, he shrank deeper into the shadows, as if darkness could erase him. Volunteers had stopped trying to coax him out. His growls and trembling were louder than words. But on that morning, something shifted. The corridor door groaned open, spilling sunlight onto the cracked floor. A woman paused halfway down, her gaze catching on the corner others had learned to ignore. At first, she saw nothing but shadow. Then, two eyes glinted back at her, glassy and broken, like embers struggling not to die out. She crouched. Slowly, almost impossibly, she reached her hand through the bars. The German shepherd did not move. The air between them tightened, thick with fear, thick with possibility. One wrong move, and he would disappear into himself. One right move, and everything could change. And then, something flickered.
In the heart of the shelter, where the air was thick with bleach and the cries of desperate dogs echoed against concrete, there was one cage most people never noticed. It sat in the far corner, away from the easy path visitors took. The others barked, wagged, and begged for attention, but this cage was silent. Inside lay a German shepherd, once strong and noble, now a shadow of himself. His body was gaunt, fur matted, ribs pressing against skin as though his frame could not carry the weight of despair. The shelter had given him a name, just a practical label to track his paperwork, but it never seemed to belong to him. He ignored voices, turned away from food, and pressed himself so tightly against the cold wall it looked as though he wished to disappear into it. A volunteer once whispered, "He doesn't even want to live anymore," and in the dim light, it felt true. Rumors trickled through the staff. He had been abandoned after years of service as a guard dog, or perhaps discarded when age dulled his obedience. Nobody knew the full story, only fragments carried in the scars across his muzzle and the haunted stillness in his eyes. Nights were the worst. When the other dogs fell into restless sleep, his whimpering filled the silence. By dawn, he had retreated once more, silent and invisible. Weeks passed, and his condition worsened. Food bowls returned untouched. Water sat stagnant. His weight dropped. The vet, weary from years of similar cases, spoke in a low, almost resigned voice. "If he doesn't start eating, his body will shut down. It won't take much longer." Those words settled heavy in the shelter. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew what came next. The paperwork, the quiet decision, the ending no one wanted to take responsibility for. Time was running out for the dog in the shadows, and no one could reach him. And then, just as the days blurred into the same endless silence, the shelter door opened and everything shifted.
She wasn't extraordinary at first glance, just another visitor wandering the shelter aisles, her footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors, dozens of dogs pressed against their cages, eager for her attention. But her gaze lingered on the corner, where silence clung like a shroud. Where others saw only shadow, she noticed movement. A pair of eyes, dim yet burning faintly, locked with hers. She crouched slowly, letting her hand fall through the gap in the bars. She did not call out. She did not coax or beg. She simply waited, still and quiet, her palm open. For a long moment, nothing happened. The shepherd stayed pressed against the wall, his breath shallow, ears pulled back tight against his head. But in that silence, something unseen passed between them. A fragile recognition that he had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. She came back the next day, and the next, always to the same corner, always lowering herself to the concrete floor, resting her hand against the bars. At first, he did nothing. Then, one day, a flick of his ear broke the stillness. Another day, his nose trembled, scenting her hand from across the cage. These were victories so small most would have missed them, but she noticed. And she stayed. Not every day was progress. One afternoon, as she shifted slightly too close, he lunged at her, teeth snapping against the bars with a sharp metallic clang. The sound echoed, startling everyone. A volunteer muttered, "He's too far gone. Dangerous." But she didn't flinch. Her hand fell back to her side, and she whispered something soft. Not words meant to train, but words meant to comfort. Days stretched into weeks. A rhythm formed. Her quiet visits, his tentative curiosity. The fragile dance between fear and hope. Each time she left, his eyes followed her just a fraction longer. Each time she returned, his body trembled with indecision, but did not retreat quite as far. It was a battle fought in inches, in breaths, in patience most people never gave. And then one morning, something happened. His paw shifted forward, scraping against the concrete, carrying him a single step closer to the hand that waited. His body trembled violently, torn between instinct and longing. For the first time, the shadows loosened their grip. But just as hope flickered, his body gave out. He collapsed where he stood.
Hope was fragile, and it broke suddenly. One evening, after days of tentative progress, the shepherd staggered as he rose to his feet. His legs trembled beneath his thin frame, then gave out completely. He collapsed against the bars, his shallow breaths rattling in the still air. Panic spread quickly through the shelter. A call went out. The woman's face turned pale, and within minutes he was rushed into the back room where the harsh glow of vet lights burned down on him. The diagnosis was grave. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, ulcers from stress that had gone untreated for too long. His organs were failing under the weight of neglect. The vet, a man who had seen too many lost causes, spoke bluntly. "He has a 50-50 chance at best. If he doesn't fight, there's nothing we can do." His words echoed like a sentence. The woman sat beside the table as IV lines were set, her hand trembling as it wrapped gently around his paw. Machines beeped in rhythm with the silence, measuring his fragile heartbeat. His eyes were half closed, trapped between worlds, yet when her thumb brushed his fur, his paw twitched faintly in response. She leaned close, whispering in a voice steady only because it had to be. "I'm here. Don't let go. Please, don't let go." The night stretched endlessly. Every hour another battle. Nurses came and went, adjusting fluids, checking vitals. Each moment seemed to tip toward loss, but then he'd stir faintly, as if clinging to some invisible thread. Once his breathing faltered so suddenly that the room froze. The vet's hands moved quickly, administering medication, coaxing his lungs back into rhythm. The silence afterward was unbearable. But in the small hours before dawn, when exhaustion should have swallowed her whole, the woman noticed something. His eyes fluttered open, not wide, not strong, but enough. And for the first time, instead of turning away, he let his gaze linger on her face. It was faint, fleeting, but unmistakable. Recognition. He had not given up. Still, the fight was far from over. The vet warned that the next days would decide everything. Each step forward could be lost in a heartbeat. But for the first time, the woman believed he might choose to stay. And if he chose to stay, she vowed he would never let him go back into the shadows again. The battle had begun, and no one knew how it would end.
Recovery was never smooth, never certain. Each day was a fragile experiment in survival. The shepherd returned to the shelter's recovery wing, wrapped in quiet care. his body frail but alive. The woman visited constantly, sometimes reading softly to him, sometimes simply sitting, her presence the anchor he leaned on. Progress came in whispers. The first time he finished a bowl of food, the moment he managed to stand without collapsing, the tentative steps down the narrow hallway. Every victory was shadowed by setbacks. Startling noises sent him cowering. The sight of strangers made him tremble violently. His scars were not just physical, they ran deep into his trust. When the shelter cleared him for fostering, the woman signed the papers without hesitation. She brought him home, preparing every corner with care, blankets in quiet spaces, bowls placed gently in reach, toys that waited for discovery rather than demand. At first, he lingered near the door, body rigid, eyes scanning every shadow as though expecting betrayal. But her patience remained unshaken. Each night, she left her hand hanging quietly at her side, just as she had at the shelter, waiting for him to choose. One evening, weeks into his stay, the moment came. He approached quietly, hesitant as always, and lowered his head until his muzzle brushed her palm. She froze, not daring to breathe, then slowly curled her fingers into his fur. For the first time, he did not pull away. His weight leaned into her touch, fragile but real. From that night onward, something shifted. There were setbacks. He growled at shadows, flinched from sudden footsteps, sometimes refused food for days. But the milestones grew brighter. He wagged his tail for the first time. He lay down near her feet instead of hiding across the room. One night he slept without trembling, his chest rising in calm rhythm, the first peaceful rest she had ever seen him take. And then came the breakthrough. On a quiet morning, sunlight streamed through the open back door. He stood, gazing at the brightness spilling across the floor. For a long time, he hesitated. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, out of the shadowed house and into the light. His paws pressed into the grass, his nose lifted to the wind. For the first time, he chose the outside world, not as something to fear, but as something to claim. The woman watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes, knowing they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had begun to live again.
Months later, he was a different dog, the same body, the same bones, but transformed by survival and care. His coat had thickened, shining under the sunlight. His frame filled out, no longer frail, but powerful, steady. Yet the most striking change was in his eyes. Where once they had been dull and clouded, now they burned with clarity, with life. The woman often thought back to that first day, the shadowed cage, the silence, the haunted stillness. Now she watched him race across fields, ears flying back, tongue lolling in unrestrained joy. She never stopped marveling at the miracle of it. This was not just recovery, it was rebirth. But scars remained. Loud bangs still made him recoil. Strangers approaching too quickly sent him tense. Healing was not erasure, she knew, but growth. He carried his past with him, yet no longer let it cage him. And every time he hesitated, she was there, patient, steady, the hand that reached out and promised he would never be alone again. The moment that sealed everything came quietly. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the living room in gold, he rested his head fully on her lap. His weight was heavy, trusting. She stroked his fur, tears warming her eyes. For so long he had refused to let himself rest. Now he had chosen her as his home. Looking at him, she thought about all the animals still waiting in shadows, all the silent cages that went unnoticed. How many were vanishing inside themselves, unseen, unheard, on the brink of surrender? How many could be saved by one outstretched hand? She whispered into the quiet, though it was as much for herself as for him. You were the one who taught me not to give up, not to look away. One hand can change everything." And so the story came full circle. Not just his rescue, but hers too. In reaching for him, she found a deeper truth. Resilience is never lost, only hidden, waiting for someone to believe it still exists. The final image is of the German shepherd, running freely in the open, the wind tearing through his coat, sunlight illuminating every muscle as though the world itself celebrated his survival. No more shadows, no more silence, only life. And for anyone watching, the message lingers. In the end, we are all the hand, or the one waiting for it.